Welcome back. I again appreciate the audience. Thanks so much for being here. It's been a delight to work with this amazing bunch of panelists, people with tremendous Colorado River experience and actionable experience, but it doesn't work without the broader community, both those of you here in person and those out online. Hi, I think I'm waving to a camera somewhere. Thanks. Thanks all for joining us. I would like to briefly introduce this panel, and then I'll turn it over to Ted, who's going to moderate this panel. When we were planning the conference and came up with the theme for this panel, it was at least a week or two ago, when things were very, very different in the Colorado River Basin. And I want to explain the title and the theme here, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because in a series of conferences like this that we all participate in over the last 9 months or so, we had various discussions with different leaders in the Colorado River Basin community suggesting different sort of planning targets for us, where John Entsminger at the last conference here suggested we needed to be planning for what we would do if it was an 11 million acre foot river. John D'Antonio, who was then the state engineer of the state of New Mexico, my home state, suggested, well, really 13 million might be a more scientifically defensible number. And then at a conference in Salt Lake City in March, Andy Mueller from the Colorado River Water Conservation District said, we need to be planning, we need to be ready, knowing what we're going to do at the 9 million acre foot river. And these were all discussions about sort of long range planning targets. And in the time between us thinking up this panel, the reservoirs are empty, and suddenly the notion of even thinking about the long term is challenging, but I appreciate these the people on this panel being game to sort of take that over and I take that on. I'd like to hand over to Ted Kowalski, who's held many hats, and I'll let him introduce himself to moderate this panel. Ted, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much to the University of Colorado School of Law for inviting me and including me on this August panel. I'm going to just give you a couple of additional quotes and a backstory for those of know about the movie Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but it's about two men who form an easy relationship or an alliance to race in the southwestern United States to find a treasure buried in the Southwest. And it's not unlike the Colorado River or the people on this panel. These are uneasy relationships, and we're racing to try to solve big problems, as we've been talking about most of today and most of this week with the hearings back in DC and all. I'm going to give you two additional quotes, especially building on the panel that we just heard from the movie. And one is, if you want a guarantee, buy a toaster. And I think that's also apropos to this conversation. Whether it's 13, 11, or 9, no guarantees. We are still all figuring out where that floor is, and it is shifting underneath us. And the other quote is more apropos to the testimony that we heard the commissioner give earlier this week. And there's a quote from the movie. There are two kinds of people, my friend, those with loaded guns and those who dig. You dig. And I think that's essentially what the commissioner was saying to the states and the water users in this community. We got to roll up our sleeves and start digging because we have big problems to solve. And I'm excited to explore some of the solutions that we're going to talk about here today. I'm going to give a couple more remarks in a few minutes, but first I want to introduce Brad Udall, who's going to sort of set the stage in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of hydrology. So please help me welcome Brad to the
So in case you're wondering why I'm sitting all the way down there on the table, that's the anti-skunk seat. It's terrific to be back in my old haunts at the law school and to see Doug Kenny and Sean and Alice and all the folks here. I spent a year here, and it was really informative and helpful in my career. So I was asked to kick us off, and this will duplicate not very much what Jeff said earlier and what Jim said. I think it's a different look. And so I've got roughly 10 slides. So 3 Fahrenheit temperature increases since 1970. Everybody in the room knows this. or something close to that. But the other point I'll make is that oval circle there, that blue oval circle, we have not been below the 20th century since the year 2000, and it's unlikely we ever will be, at least not in the lifetime of anyone in this room. That's the point I would make on this slide. So this slide, I think, is really interesting and has more information than perhaps many of us are aware. So since 2018, precipitation really has gone downward in the basin. And 2018 is the single worst year going back to 1895 in the upper Colorado River Basin. If you look, all those red arrows are low years. And the precipitation pattern has been unusual, right? Pretty good winter precip, but a decline in the spring and a decline in the summer. And there's this super interesting tie to soil moisture. You know, historically, we thought that summer precipitation didn't matter at all because it didn't apparently change the runoff. But if you look in the Colorado River Basin, it's about an inch. In the upper Colorado, it's about an inch every month. It's pretty constant. And what it now appears is that summer precipitation kept our soil moisture at least from dropping out. And it's that decline in soil moisture that then the following spring, when runoff occurs, causes real problems. A couple other things I want to make a point here. So all those low years are in the red arrows there. Move that blue box to the left. Do you see anything like that in the rest of that historical period? I don't. It's really different. And Jeff hinted that there are now attribution studies out there that suggest this precipitation decline has an anthropogenic component to it, and that's really worrisome. The other part of this is the upper blue box. Look at the highs there. There are 3 that are in that upper blue box, and take that box visually off to the left. Do you see anything like that in the historical record? I don't. So both the highs and the lows are offset low, and the highs are far less frequent than they were in the 20th century. Runoff 2 weeks earlier or more, and it's clearly tied to this shutoff in precip in the spring. 2021, it starts 6 weeks ahead there in green, and in 2020 about 2 weeks. And that just greens things up earlier, causes ET to happen sooner. Any given day is likely to be warmer, and this atmosphere that's thirstier and wants to suck more out. So how many of you heard the worst drought in 1,200 years in the press? All right, so that comes from this paper in this year and an earlier paper in 2020 in Science. And you know what they're measuring in this paper? Anybody know what that is? June, July, August soil moisture. That's how they're measuring drought. And, you know, historically, soil moisture, it's kind of easy to not think, oh, that's for farmers or that's for your gardeners. But it's truly the most important reservoir of moisture that's out there. No soil moisture, no plants. No plants, no animals. That's why soil moisture is so important. And the image here on the left, those are ranks of these 15 different droughts they looked at, and the 20 to 21 drought rank is what they're measuring against. So the number 1, the dark color there on the left observed image is what we're looking at. And if you look at that image, what outline jumps out at you? The Colorado River Basin, right? It's right there to see. The image on the right is without anthropogenic climate change. The one on the left is with. And this soil moisture thing is really important, and it's sort of been overlooked. All right, natural flow declines at 20% since 2000. This is just the combined storage. You know, we had 15 and change million acre feet from 1906 to 1999, depending on exactly what numbers you're using for recent estimates, 12.3 million acre feet from 2000 on. The ugly is right there, 9.4 million acre feet from 2000 to 2004. And bad is 11, I would tell you, from 2018 to 2022. So they're all there. Maybe good's 12.3, although none too good, right? So the unregulated inflows, that is the flows into Powell with the effects of upstream reservoir operations removed. Those flows since the year 2000 are actually less than the upper basin needs to meet what I would call the old Section 3D 8.23 million acre feet delivered, non-depletion obligation. Let me get the language on that. And when Eric talked about this earlier today, you know, I heard him sort of say, well, we're physically not going to make these releases because we don't want to. That's kind of what I heard. And that's going to cause a compact problem. This story is slightly different. It says we can't make them if these flows continue. That's a different kind of story. And of course, this notion that Overpeck and I and others have been talking about, this isn't a drought. It's not the new normal. You probably heard me say this. If you want to call it something, call it the new abnormal. New normal implies predictability. We don't have that. It's likely to get worse here. But this is something different. It's not drought. We should stop calling it that. Here's some mid-century futures just to set the stage for this panel. Temperatures 2 to 3 times our existing warming. As Jeff pointed out, really unclear patterns on precipitation. Flows, you know, there's some paleo flows at 11.8 million acre feet for 25 years. But I'll note there's a brand new paper that Reclamation put out just within the last couple of weeks that talks about a really bad drought, roughly 2,000 years ago, if I recall the press release on it right. Continuation of present flow is certainly possible. 2000 to 2004 at 9.4 million breaks the system. If you look at climate models and hydrology model futures, you can see as low as 9 over 25 years. If you do what Jeff did with my work with Overpeck and Chris Milley and Krista Dunn, you can get somewhere between maybe 10.6 on the low end at mid-century, or Chris Milley and Krista Dunn's 9 million acre feet, a 40% decline possibly. And continued warming and drying of the basin really likely. And this is work that Kevin Wheeler and I and others, Jack Schmidt, Eric was on this last year, and it looked at various different futures, starting from what were at the time roughly 22 or 23 million acre feet, and the different combinations of upper basin caps and lower basin reductions and what might happen to those reservoirs. And I put the star on there just to show you how different things are a year later with combined storage. And I'll note that this isn't all that different than what the commissioner told us we needed to do. It's in the same ballpark. And I'll also make a note that you will see a revised version of this paper in a major scientific publication within the next 2 months that basically has the same story, but a little easier to read. So, and then I want to make a plea and with 2 quick slides. We need better looking forward vision, and I'm going to pick on the 24-month study just for a second here. Those are unregulated inflows, 8.4 million is the average from 2000 to 2021. There you go. That's the average. The June study that just came out has 6.7 million acre feet in 2023. And let me just put a line there for you. Does that look like a 10% chance to you? It's not. The 10% chance is like in the 3 to 4 million acre foot. It's the 2 lowest bars there. We can and should and must do a better job with those minimum probable studies. I completely understand the difficulties around some of the challenges on this, but everybody's looking at those right now. And that's just my point. It's a lot lower than that. And in October, you'll see that 6.7 million acre feet jump if it did what it did last year to 4 million acre feet in 1 month. So from the August, we'll have a September 24 month because we're in the DROA, and then we'll have an October and it'll fall off the cliff more likely than not, confusing all of us. Let me leave us with this slide here. Combined Mead and Powell volume, January 1990, April 2022. I already went through these numbers. I want to make actually 2 points with this. Anybody see anything that looks like a 2-year filling period in here? No, there isn't one. There's not a 2-year filling period in there. There's 2011, which really jumps out at you as big, but we then spent it all down in 2013, 2012, and 2013. The law of mass balance didn't get invented on Tuesday when we heard the testimony that we need to cut 2 to 4 million acre feet. We've known this for a while. And so we put us in the pickle we're in right now. And I'll let you pick when we should have made different decisions, but I'd argue it's a lot sooner than now when we're below 30%. And you can see the red dotted line down there, the minimum probable going below 20% by 2024. So I'll go back to my seat off the edge of the table here, just so I don't smell up.
So I live in Louisville. I work for the Walton Family Foundation. I live literally just 6 miles down the way. And I didn't think it would be responsible to talk about admire in the graphs and the numbers if we didn't also talk about how we are all experiencing climate change in real dramatic ways. And in December of this year, my family was asked to evacuate. We had, the worst devastating fire in Colorado's history, and climate change is here. It's dramatic, and I wanted to just sort of take us out of the numbers and the graphs and the mind, and just bring us to the heart and help us just realize some of the challenges. And this is a little video I'm going to show. It's from a friend of my daughter as she was evacuating, and it's a little dramatic. There's some foul language, but I think it's appropriate in the case. And then I'll bring us back and we'll do some introductions. So please. So thank you. We're giving challenges to the next generation, and we have benefited from the compact 100 years this year of decisions that we've been able to make in a future, and we have to give our kids, our communities, our families, our tribes, our environment a future. And I think it's inextricably linked to water. Wildfires are a part of that. If you look at the 6 most devastating fires, they were occurring in Colorado in 2012 and 2013, and then in 2020, 2021. And so when, there's water is tied to it directly, and we have to solve these problems, and we have to come to the table, and we can't be pointing at other sectors or other countries or other basins. We need to be looking in the mirror and working together to solve these problems and with real solutions. And we at the Walton Family Foundation, and just me personally, we're ready to help. We've been, ringing the alarm bell for years. It seems like and feels like and it's our time is now, and let's get to it. Okay, I'm not going to leave it there. I wanted to introduce our panelists, and I was thinking a little bit about maybe a way to transition it, and it's baseball season, and I'm a big baseball fan. So I have some Colorado River baseball trading card series just to introduce our panelists. You can get them here afterwards. So Brad Udall, he is the son of baseball great, not Colorado River great, Mo Udall, and the nephew of Stuart Udall, and you can see the different teams he's been on over the years. But Brad's no stranger to the Colorado River Basin community and has been on a lot of different teams, to be sure. And we've already heard from Brad, but I'm sure he's going to be contributing as we go along with some questions in a few minutes. And next up, we have Ann Castle, who has also been on a variety of different teams. And notably, where she started as a rookie, the current Assistant Secretary of Water and Science also was there. And I would put her card up, but I don't think we have enough room to put Assistant Secretary Trujillo's different teams. She's been traded so many times. Then we have Jennifer Pitt, who actually I am pleased to say started with the National Park Service and has worked in Congress and EDF and is now at the National Audubon Society. And then next up, John Entsminger, primarily stuck with one team. He's
The Yankees.
Yeah. But he's really pleased to have him here today. And then finally and last, we have Kathryn Sorensen, who's had a variety of different roles with different cities and different teams down in the lower basin. And then recently has been traded to the Arizona State University, and excited to have her here. And I thought of this a little bit because, you know, we've seen this happen. And I think it's what makes this basin great. Is we have the Chuck Cullum from the lower basin, and we have the Chuck Cullum from the upper basin. And, you know, people are willing to try on different hats. And I think it allows us to be empathetic, and it allows us to see, you know, different perspectives, and to not, or to all understand that at the end of the day, we have to go home to our states or to our reservations or to our homes and our communities and have to defend what decisions you've made. And if you've been on different teams, I think it just makes it a little bit easier to solve problems, and to not just blame the other person or put all of the solution making on a specific sector or specific state or basin or country. And so that's our task. I believe in this community, this Colorado River Basin community, greatly, and I think we can rise to that challenge. But now we're going to get into the throes of what are those challenges, how and how are we going to address it. So I think we can maybe take that off. Okay. Great. So we have a few questions that we're going to just tackle one by one. And getting back to the title of the presentation, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where the good was 13, I think the bad is 11, and the ugly is 9. And we did hear from the last panel that maybe we shouldn't be picking a number because as soon as we do, that's the wrong number. But nevertheless, I'll ask each of the panelists to talk about where on that continuum do you believe that we should be for our planning, and to talk a little bit about why. And so we'll start with you, Anne.
Okay, thanks, Ted. And I love the baseball cards. I think, first of all, I want to just point out the premise behind the title of this panel, the 3 different flow numbers, and recognize that's not the way we operate right now. We operate based on lake levels. That's our system of operation. People have been saying for a number of years that that's not the right way to operate. We should focus on actual hydrology, actual flows in the river. That's what this does. But I just wanted to point that out, because that in itself is a sea change in the way we have been accustomed to thinking about river operations. And I'll totally chattel the previous panel in that I don't think we should be picking a number. We can't do that. The volatility of the Colorado River has always been there and is only becoming, I think, more exacerbated. We need to have scenarios for a range of possible flows that would be triggered by, you know, some multi-year average of what the flows are. And I think Brad's charts point that out. We've already experienced the ugly. That's the 9 million acre feet scenario that we saw in the 5-year period between 2000 and 2004. These are not far-fetched scenarios. We absolutely need to be prepared to deal with the kind of hydrology we've already seen.
Yeah, so I guess I would agree that it's not one number. If you look at the stuff Jim Prairie showed us, it's probably less important whether we choose 9, 11, or 13. But I do think we have to come up with a worst case scenario that we're willing to plan for. But that's probably more like if we get 4 6s in a row, regardless of then if you get a couple of big years that change the average upward. So I think coming up with the scenario we're willing to plan for, and what's the worst of that, because you know that's probably at least 11. I was glad that my number in October hasn't already gone off of Brad's chart. So I think multiple scenarios is the path forward. And I think very similar to, some of the things Amy said, I don't think it's run of the river because you need more certainty than that, right? The cities can't be like, in January 1, we have no idea how much water we're going to get, in the next calendar year. But if you did it more off of a total system contents instead of just Meade Powell operations, and then have more of a percentage basis where people are going to have some predictability as those total system contents go up and down, I think could be a good approach. Jennifer?
I'm not sure I have a whole lot new to add, except that I do recall the education I got during the basin study years. A lot of you lived through that with me, and we were introduced to the cone of uncertainty. And I think we need to keep that in mind and not gravitate towards a number, but anticipate that as bad as things feel right now, we know they can get worse. Everything we hear about temperature increases suggests that they will. And so I'm really hopeful that we don't do things in our planning like average the historic hydrology with climate change hydrology results, which is what we ended up doing in the basin study. I will also add that I was playing around with numbers last night, and someone already commented, Brad, I think already commented on the sort of message that the 24-month study is sending with the 10%, minimum probable hydrology, not really reflecting a true 10%. I also wanted to add that I think our sense of our reservoirs being 30% full, providing us with some sort of 30% buffer is also a little bit of false security, because as we heard this year with the Bureau's decision to hold water back to avoid having to use bypass tubes that potentially threaten the infrastructure, we are going to protect certain levels, and we have dead pool. So if you consider dead pool at all the big system reservoirs, and then 3490 at Powell and 1000 at Meade, we're actually at 14%. And that's a really different number to think about than 30%. The alarm bells should be going off. And I'll just conclude by saying that maybe that's better. That for those of us who have been looking at the Colorado River Delta, we've known that for half a century in most years, there's no water coming out the bottom of this river. That's a sign that our supply and demands are out of balance. We now, in the last 20 years, have blown through 40 million acre feet of storage. So that's about 2 million acre feet a year that we've lost, and here we are.
So I've spent most of my, it is me. Of course it is. I have spent most of my baseball career with municipalities. And so I'm always going to be on team public health. And planning for public health does not involve planning around a number. It involves planning for many different scenarios. It involves looking at starting conditions, where we are in the lakes, and then looking at all the different risks across all those different scenarios and coming up with adaptive strategies that make sure we are protecting public health. And inherent in that idea is the idea that you cannot live on the razor's edge. When it comes to municipal deliveries at the tap, what matters most is certainty. And so you have to build a buffer into the system to provide that certainty for reliable flows to customers.
Just really quickly, when you do water management modeling with reservoirs, a really important variable is what level do you start your reservoirs at? Our job has become much simpler, actually, because that number's really low right now. And so it removes this source of potential uncertainty. That's point one. And point two is actually the term dead pool, in the case of Lake Mead, is starting to take on new meaning.
Care to comment?
For anybody who hasn't seen it, they're actually selling bottled water labeled as Lake Mead corpse water in the service territory for which I'm responsible for any of the water utilities. So that's how my life is right now.
Great. Well, some of you have already hinted at this, but yeah, I'll ask you to elaborate a little bit more in terms of, what is the flow where the river without significant reform is no longer functional? And in what sense is it not functional now? And what does that look like to you in each of your individual communities? And what scares you? Like what frightens you in terms of the future? Sure, we'll start with the scientists.
No, don't start with me.
All right, I'll give it a try. So I think the law of the river is always functional. It just leads to some outcomes that are politically unacceptable. But I want to put that in context. So does every other institutional governance structure that we could come up with. So I think it's important to remember that yeah, it has its warts, and a lot of those warts are really showing right now, but it functions. It does potentially force those who have high value uses yet low priority water rights to seek out high priority water rights. And I don't say that lightly. I know that causes a great amount of controversy. No one wants to do it, but cities looking to the future just may not have much of a choice in that regard. And then I would also say it's not really flow numbers per se that scare me. It's the risk and consequences of hitting dead pool that really scare me. And it scared me enough in 2014. You want to talk about thresholds? We're way past thresholds for me. Looking at starting elevations in Lake Mead back in 2013 and then seeing what hydrology could do to this system, I was scared back then. And I think flows, I don't know what flows were back then, but they were higher than they are now. And I was scared enough to start planning and investing in, a $500 million pipeline for the city of Phoenix to take water from the Salton Verde River system and pump it into areas of Phoenix's distribution system that were entirely dependent on Colorado River water. Because even though back then in 2014, the risk of hitting dead pool was remote, the consequences are just, they're unimaginable. So it's not so much a flow level that scares me, it's looking at the elevations and the trends and the risk of hitting dead pool.
I think, another perspective on the law of the river is that it may be no longer functioning today for those who have water rights, but for those stakeholders and interests who never were included, starting with the compact, it has never worked. And that included Mexico until 1944 when the treaty was defined. It certainly includes the 30 tribes that are in the basin, and it includes environmental water resources, which, by the way, if you try to tally up what the actual consumptive use water rights are for the environment in the basin, I think they did that in the basin study. It's almost nothing. The environment, natural resources, the rivers themselves, every living thing that depends on them are relying on inadvertent opportunity to experience water. And if we allow the reservoirs to drive us into crisis decision-making now and in perpetuity, that's my greatest fear, because at that point, those of us who represent environmental interests really have no way to get traction. There's no way to break through into the titans of the 7 states and then the US and Mexico battling it out over a declining supply to say, what about the natural world around us? And so I guess my fear is a perpetual state of crisis management.
So I guess I would say the previous panel got asked the question, what's your definition of equity? And I would say, though it's imperfect, I would say my definition of equity is equality of risk and transparency, which are the same two factors you need for any human market to function well. And I'm not suggesting that the river should be a market, but to have functionality, you want equality of risk and you want transparency. And it's hard to imagine us doing any worse job in drafting a law of the river that goes counter to both of those things. It's incredibly opaque, and the inequality of risk created by Article 10B in the 44 Treaty, CAP's junior priority in the 68 Act, the non-depletion clause between the upper and lower basin, you have nothing remotely approaching equality of risk. And until we correct that, a lot of these other things that people want to try to accomplish are not going to occur, in my opinion.
I think I was struck by John's question, and you've brought it up again, Ted, about what does this look like for the communities you care about? This situation that we find ourselves in now, and Commissioner Tutin's challenge to find an additional 2 to 4 million acre feet. And just thinking about Colorado, no more snowmaking. What do our ski areas look like if we don't have snowmaking anymore? Those are junior water rights. And maybe there's trade-offs, but those are the kinds of things we need to think about. What does it look like if part of our West Slope agriculture doesn't exist anymore? What does that do to food security? What does it do to those communities? Those are the things that we've got to be thinking pretty hard about. I guess we can think of the law of the river in different ways and whether or not it's functional. And I totally agree with Kathryn that it has worked. We have seen the adaptation required to adjust to the different climate situations that we find ourselves in. But it doesn't today have the mechanism to deal with what we've just been talking about all day. It doesn't have the mechanism to find that 2 to 4 million additional acre feet of savings. So we have to build on the current law of the river to be able to do that. And the way that has to look, I think, brings us back to equity. And there's so many different considerations that go into that. I agree with John. We have to consider equity in terms of what the compact told us and the risks that were allocated there, but also the fairness of that in the light of climate change, the assignment of risk to the upper basin, the subordination of the Central Arizona Project in 1968, the exclusion of tribes from the equation. All of those things have to go into the package of coming up with an equitable solution. And I don't think that's easy, but I think that's what the basin state principles and the tribal sovereigns and the Department of the Interior are trying to do right now.
And can I just add just one more thing? I did think, I really liked the previous panel, but I thought one thing they got stuck in a little bit was they kept coming back and talking about the compact, right? The compact, ignoring, the 56 Act, the 68 Act, the 44 Treaty, all of the work that's been done this century and the surplus guidelines, the 07 guidelines, all the minutes with Mexico and then the DCP. I mean, the law of the river has evolved, right? It's looking wholly insufficient when you look at the numbers Brad shows, but we have taken steps to add flexibility into the law of the river. And one big example I would use is in the DCP, California agreed to make contributions to preserve Lake Mead levels in the face of the 68 Act. They could have stayed behind that brick wall. So there is sort of these grass shoots of possibilities that a negotiated process can continue to produce a river that works for everybody. It's when you only get to mess up once, right? We've been successful in our negotiations for the last 25 years. The first time those negotiations fail, then the river stops.
So let me just make a quick point where I get a little uneasy with the law of the river, and it deals with Denver's junior status relative to West Slope diverters. It deals with Metropolitan's junior status relative to Imperial, and it deals with Phoenix's junior status relative to Yuma. Now, I'm not suggesting that those cities should go grab that water, but that is a huge hole that we need to figure out how to solve, because there is no way you're going to dry up Phoenix's cap water and Yuma has no contribution. There's no way you're going to dry up Denver without a West Slope contribution, and there's no way Metropolitan takes a hit without an Imperial contribution. I don't know how that works.
Well, let's delve into that just a little bit more, because I think, you're pointing out a obvious elephant in the room in terms of urban versus agricultural, or, those sectors. And I didn't hear the commissioner say, we're going to come up with 2 to 4 million, and I'm only going to focus on this state, or I'm only going to focus on this basin, or I'm only going to focus on this sector. She's looking at, and the department's looking at all of it. And we're going to have an agricultural panel, I think, tomorrow morning. We heard some remarks earlier, but how do we solve that problem, and the one that you just sort of elucidated? Because I agree with you, the cities are not going to have zero water. So Kathryn, yeah.
Sure. I mean, others have said it. It takes everyone, every sector, every state, everyone has to be involved. There are a lot of tools in our toolbox, and we have been innovative in deploying those. Maybe we need to think about scale, right? So, we have done a lot with municipal conservation. Like other metropolitan areas, Phoenix's water use per capita has fallen 30% in 20 years. It uses the same amount of water as it did back in the 1990s and has added, 500,000 people to its population. So we've accomplished a lot, but we've got to dig deeper. We need to think more about scale. System conservation. And we've done a great job with system conservation. I think, when Arizona is looking at closing in on, I think it's around 800,000 acre feet, in Lake Mead. But we need to think about scale. We do have these tools available to us, and we've been really innovative, and hats off to those in the negotiating room who have come up with those ideas. But I think we need to think more about scale.
Please.
I will add that I think, of the big elephants in the room, perhaps the Imperial Irrigation District is the biggest of them. And I've said this before in public settings. I think it's, they say it themselves, it is hard for them to consider reducing water uses when it leaves them with an environmental and public health disaster in their midst. And if we all want communities to come to the table and talk in a sort of voluntary way about reducing water uses, I think we have to be maybe more intentional and more rigorous in our approach to addressing concerns like that, which may actually enable them to engage in transactions. I think we saw that in the minute process with Mexico. Mexico had no, court of Switzerland telling them that they had to sign up to share shortages with the United States. It was very poorly or really not defined how they share shortages in the 1944 treaty. Minute 319 was the first place where Mexico got a quantified shortage, and they were able to do so because the United States agreed to cooperate with Mexico on a number of other areas, including investments in irrigation infrastructure upgrades, but also including some very modest commitments of water and dollars to restore habitat in the Colorado River Delta. So I think that actually thinking more broadly can open up some opportunities with communities that do have the senior water rights and at the moment don't seem that interested in talking about reducing their uses because they have that senior right and because they have some real concerns about what they're left with when they, when they give up that water. And I want to add one more thing, which is that, and this is kind of skipping ahead a little bit. I heard just a month or so ago about a program that the state of Colorado has put up. I think it was established in the last year, called the Office of Just Transitions, and it's intended to assist communities that were coal-producing communities with the transition that we're going through broadly in our economy to not relying on coal so much anymore. And it's support for individuals who are the impacted workers, the wage earners, but also support for the communities. In other words, the municipal and the county government that is having reduced revenues. And Colorado has also made a fervent pitch to say this can't just be on the state of Colorado alone to support this economic transition. They've got a whole plea for help from the federal government. I think that it's hard to engage people in the conversation. It's hard to engage agricultural water users in the conversation about this when they are intent on holding on to their water. But I think we're at the moment right now, given the scale of the reductions that the commissioner has called for, that we should be thinking about helping those communities and not just watching them lose their water and lose foundations of their community.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. But I do want to revisit the math of the municipalities. Sarah talked a little bit earlier about cutting cities in Arizona, all the cities in Arizona in half would equate to about 250,000 acre feet. But if you take a step back a little bit further and look at a basin, if you literally evacuate Denver, Salt Lake City, Albuquerque, Vegas, Tucson, Phoenix, and Los Angeles, it doesn't equal 4 million acre feet. So I'm not anti-ag. The people of Las Vegas like cheeseburgers. They want them to keep growing alfalfa and feeding cows. But I gave you my definition of equity earlier. My definition of what isn't equity is math. Math doesn't care about equity. Math's hard, it's unforgiving. And if you got to cut 4 million acre feet out of this system, and you don't want 6 simultaneous Katrina level events, some water's gonna come out of ag. I hate to be the one that skip to the last page of the book, but it's gonna be part of the solution. So, but I'm all in with what Jennifer's saying too. When Senator Manchin asked me what one thing I would ask Congress to do on Tuesday, what did I say? Did I ask for money for the cities? No, I said you need to make massive investments in helping agriculture be more efficient, to grow the same amount of food using radically less water. But you also need, environmental solutions for places like the Salton Sea, and you need societal solutions so that these communities aren't, overwhelmingly impacted by that.
Can I just real quick, I want to add to that. I agree 100%. And I want to add to that, no city wants this. No city wants to go out and take water from ag. It is not on anyone's like, oh yeah, great, sign me up. But we are looking at numbers that are just too big for the cities to solve alone.
And sorry, we're not talking about reducing agricultural uses so cities can use more. My city is absolutely gonna, if they want to continue to grow, they will have to do so with the same or less water. That's the future of cities within the Colorado River Basin. So you're not talking about your grandfather's ag to urban transfers, at least not in my state. We're not. What we're talking about is the cold hard math of what you call it, the law of mass balance. I thought Colby almost did a cartwheel when you said the law of mass balance wasn't invented on Tuesday. It's math.
Yeah. And let me go back on that real quick. So when I had to sell this, $500 million pipeline to the Phoenix City Council, which is not a fun thing to do, I got that same pushback. Well, why should, those of us who are in council districts that are very well established, these old communities, why should we be paying for growth? And I said, this is not for growth. This is for resiliency for who is here today. And I agree, the cities have to not only live on what they are already using, they have to continue to reduce, and they have to do more with reclaimed water and other solutions that make sure that our footprint goes down, not up.
And ditto on, this is a basin-wide, sector-wide problem. The numbers that we have to save are far too large for any one basin, any one state, 2 states, 3 states, 4 states, 6 states to solve by themselves. This has to be a basin-wide solution, but I want to give one other reason why that is the case. And that is because we're operating in a political environment. And one thing you learn about negotiations is you try to put yourself in the other guy's shoes and figure out what their interests are. And one of the interests of every basin state principal, every tribal leader, every director of a major water utility is how they're going to explain to their constituents, I've just agreed that we're going to take less water. The only way you can do that is by saying, but everybody else is feeling the pain too. Nobody's excluded. Everybody is in this together. We haven't let anybody skate. We're all doing this at the same time. And they have to be able to say that. So that's just a different way of coming to the same conclusion.
So I want to pick on that point just a little bit, and then I'll get back to the script, I promise. But I mean, because some of the work that you've been doing lately revolves around universal access to water to all. And there, we're not talking about taking less water. We're talking about getting water to new communities who are deserving, to be certain. But how do you resolve those two sides of the coin?
Yeah, and I think just to provide some context here, and Daryl did this so articulately and passionately already today, but one of the things I've learned in doing this work on tribal drinking water is that history is present. We cannot evaluate where we are today and what we need to do without thinking about history and the broader context. Daryl has given some of the history. In terms of the context about drinking water, almost half of tribal households in this country don't have either access to clean piped drinking water or adequate sanitation. In the Colorado River Basin, not every tribe has this issue, but significant numbers do. And in the Navajo Nation, the largest tribe in the country, 30 to 40% of people aren't hooked up to clean drinking water sources. This is a real problem here. And that disparity is not random. Tribal households are 19 times more likely than white households to lack indoor plumbing. This isn't random. This reflects historical and structural inequities. Every human has the right to clean drinking water. We have the opportunity to solve this now. The infrastructure bill provided significant funding for this exact purpose. And yes, these are uses that there haven't been pipes to these houses before. They have been getting water from watering stations and driving 30 miles each way to fill up their tanks and truck water back to their houses. It's not a total net deficit. The amount of water that we're talking about is very small. It's a rounding error in the overall scheme of things. And yes, it's a use that hasn't existed before in its entirety. It's one that we as a basin need to provide for.
And to put an exclamation point on that, and something that Sarah said earlier, for all that there is a very compelling equity argument about the idea that the compact was signed at a very different time and very different hydrologic realities in the upper basin. You can turn that argument on its head in the lower basin and say, well, in 1968, and our junior priority happened in a very different hydrologic time as well. And it's really helpful to remember in terms of equity that nearly half the water that is delivered through the Central Arizona Project Canal is tribal water. And that's something that we just can't lose sight of.
Great.
I do think it illustrates the point, and I agree with that. I believe universal access to clean drinking water for the tribe should be a national obligation. I agree with that. But I also agree with Jennifer that I'd like to see some Colorado River flowing into the Pacific Ocean every once in a while. The point is, though, that then you need to aim past equilibrium, right? If we're using 15-ish and we need to get to 11, cutting 4 just preserves the status quo. You don't have any extra then to do these good things with that we know need to be done. So the target needs to be some point past equilibrium in order to have this river be what I believe the vast majority in this room would like it to be.
Well, and Ann talked about how in the tribal communities the surrounding area, and you alluded to this, but Jennifer, do you want to talk a little bit more about the environmental?
Sure. Well, I already mentioned there's very little consumptive use assigned to the environment in the basin. Doesn't mean we don't actually have trees growing, but in terms of what's quantified and deliberately assigned to the environment, it's very small. And through the Minute 323, there's like a 9-year commitment of an average of 23,333 acre feet a year. And that is all technically part of Mexico's allocation. The US pays for some of it. The NGOs have acquired some of it in the Mexicali Valley, and Mexico will provide some of it. It's a very small amount of water. And I wanted to make a comment on the point people were making about we need to not aim just for equilibrium. I think I was making that point before as well, in the point of we can't live on the razor's edge of just having, supply can equal demand, or demand can equal supplies if we allow our reservoirs to refill and stop living in a state of crisis. But the more we can reduce living at that equilibrium, the more security we all have. We spent all morning talking about how we don't actually know, like we might pick a number, but we are never going to know what the number is. And so the more conservative we can be about our demands, the less risk everybody has to share. And at the same time, the more we gain some flexibility to actually manage this river in a 21st century way that reflects what it sounds to me like are all of our 21st century values.
So the next question I'm going to read just for comic relief because I feel like it's irrelevant based on what's happened this week. But the question was, what are the key thresholds or tipping points, and how do you know that we're getting close to them? And I think when the commissioner tells you you need to produce 2 to 4 million acre feet in the next 2 months, I think that's already answered. I think we're at the tipping point. We know we're at the tipping point, and I'll lead right into the next question, which is really getting to the actions or reforms that are essential to prevent that scary future. And I want to start with you, Ann, because you've been with the Department of Interior, you've sat in the seat that Tanya sits in, and advised commissioners in the past. And in that role, what are those tools? What are those actions that a secretary or an assistant secretary or commissioner are looking at? I don't think there's any trade secrets there, but just, give us a little bit of an insight into that, and then we can talk about other possible solutions.
Yeah, you bet. I think you've heard, we heard Camille say it on Tuesday, we heard Tanya say it today. They would really, really like the states and tribes and major water users to come up with an agreement themselves. And the reason they want that is because those folks are better positioned to suss out the equities and to provide for these equities that we've been talking about than Interior is on its own. So that they're not blowing smoke when they say that's their preference. There are some tools in the toolbox that they can use if things don't come together. And we've heard just recently, again, from both the commissioner and the assistant secretary, that they have the authority under various different emergency provisions or statutes or Arizona versus California, lots of different ways that they have the ability to protect the system. And by that, they mean certain elevations in the two reservoirs. But they've got some tinkering tools too. Currently, we don't account for evaporation in the lower basin. And by account, I mean it is not subtracted from the allocation to the lower basin water users. Could be. We also have this concept of water that is ordered but not diverted, where releases are made from Lake Mead, going down the river, maybe it rains, the water user who requested that water doesn't take it and it's not accounted for. Could be. We could further reduce deliveries. I mean, that's a mechanism that is utilized in the 2007 guidelines and in the DCP. The Interior, the Secretary, probably has the ability to make further reductions in those deliveries, if necessary, to protect the integrity of the infrastructure. That's easier done in the lower basin. It's harder in the upper basin, but and the upper basin, as all the upper basin principles have pointed out, does take shortages when there's low flows, just because of the operation of the priority system. We don't yet have a great handle on exactly what those reductions are. And one of the things I've been just so encouraged to learn about is the recent action by the Upper Colorado River Commission commissioners in adopting a uniform standard of measurement of consumptive use using satellite imagery and an agreed upon algorithm. That is huge. That we didn't have that. We don't have it right now. But in order to manage a scarce system, you absolutely have to have agreement on the numbers. So having that, we can figure out how much consumptive use is occurring in each of the upper basin states. And if that needs to go down, there are internal state mechanisms for doing that. That's sort of the concept of curtailment that is nobody likes to talk about, but it's out there and it happens all the time in the administration, the intrastate administration of the priority system. So there are those kinds of mechanisms, but overall, I think that the hard part is balancing all those equities and coming up with a way to allocate the burden of that 2 to 4 million acre feet, recognizing the economies that have grown up in reliance on a continued supply of water, recognizing the existing disparity in use between the upper basin and the lower basin, but also the difference in hydrology that Kathryn has pointed out between 1968, when the Central Arizona Project was subordinated, between then and now, between 1922 and now.
Thanks. And yeah, go ahead, Jennifer, and then I've
Well,
got an add-on.
Just a quick comment about what Ann said about the authorities, in particular in the lower basin being perhaps effective authorities. I will say that one thing that has started to keep me up at night is a situation where it has been the federal government using the hammer to say, these are the reductions because we haven't reached cooperative and voluntary agreements in the basin, and realizing that the biggest water using parties today have water flowing by them that goes to Mexico. And if they don't agree that their uses are reduced, they operate their diversions, right? The federal government doesn't operate those dams. In fact, most of Mexico's delivery goes into the All-American Canal and the Yuma County Water Users Association canal system to go through hydropower generators before it's dropped back into the river to be delivered to Mexico. How are we going to ensure that we can make our deliveries to Mexico? And, if that's at risk, then certainly everything we've worked on for 20 years in the Delta is at risk as well.
I wanted to hint on one point that Ann made, and it relates to a comment that, John, you made about transparency. And when you testified this week, there was some conversation about OpenET and the use of that satellite imagery. And I think that that tool and potentially that federal legislation does provide a little bit more transparency about what consumptive uses are occurring on farms. And I'd like you to just sort of talk about that. And then as we continue down the line and think about actions or reforms, we do have a once in a generation opportunity with the IIJA dollars that have literally billions of dollars over the next several years that are available for water infrastructure and for solving some of these water problems. And how do we ensure as members of this community that we don't get the same results that led us to here? How do we develop new or different solutions with that once in a generation funding that's coming forward?
Well, sure, but I think in fairness, my senator introduced the OpenET bill, so I needed to say, move forward. But as far near and near to your heart, why don't you talk about the details?
Well, all we did was support it with some resources. I think it's a great tool that is available to anyone who wants to sign up and get a license. It's a joint project between EDF, Google, NASA, and Desert Research Institute. And it's pretty remarkable that you can, in real time, essentially look at any field and at the field level scale in the entire Western United States, and you can see the metric amount of consumptive use, or you can see the ensemble versions or any other consumptive use number or algorithm that you want to choose. But it's remarkable. It's data that has been available to corporations and others for many years, but now it's available to the public and to farmers and ranchers, and they can make better decisions. And my favorite example about that is some farmers or ranchers, when they were talking about this tool, they would say, well, in the past, I would see that my neighbor Joe was turning on his sprinkler systems, and I would think, oh, he might know something I don't, so I would turn mine on. And now you can actually use this tool to be able to say, oh, no, my crops are consuming all that they possibly can. I don't need to irrigate. So you can save energy, you can save water, and it's a better way to manage the system, and it's with complete transparency. So you'll have to thank your senator for introducing that legislation, but we, of course, take no position on the legislation itself. Do you want to talk at all about the IIJA or the money and what should we be doing with, what should the community be doing with the billions of dollars that are available now?
Well, I mean, clearly, one of the big things we're really interested in is getting as much of that money to support the regional recycling project that Met, CAP, and SNWA are moving together on. I mean, in terms of, new water into the system, you don't see very many, promising opportunities, but that's a really big one. It's a substantial amount of water for the cities. So, that was our favorite part of the bipartisan bill.
Yeah. Kathryn, do you want to talk about Arizona's interest in that?
No, I think that there is a lot more that we can do with reclaimed water, and I think that dollars are desperately needed for that. It is interesting. A lot of cities invested in purple pipe systems, and that's a good thing. Purple pipe systems deliver reclaimed water to turf facilities, HOA common spaces, golf courses, those kinds of things. And looking into the future, I have to wonder if that really is going to end up being the highest and best purpose for that water. That being said, in Arizona, we do have a heat island issue, and those open spaces do provide cooling effects that are very important, particularly for disadvantaged people. So that's a hard trade-off, but I think that there is a lot more that we can do with reclaimed water, and I think that dollars are spent very wisely in that area.
And then I'll maybe ask you to talk just about one more thing with regard to Arizona, because right now the governor and the legislature are talking about this Arizona commissioner. I'll let you talk more about it, but also the issue of groundwater is related and being contemplated. And it just seems to me, as sort of an outsider looking in, that part of Arizona's brand is, that it's a great place to come. There's secure water supplies, and and it's a low tax system, and come to Arizona, you're open for business. And I think it's somewhat in jeopardy with sort of watching what's happening in the Colorado River and what's happening with groundwater, and how do you protect that brand, and how do you tackle all of these issues at the same time?
Yeah, I'm not really going to speak to protecting the brand, and really, because I will tell you, I'm not sure how much branding Arizona really needs to do. People keep coming. They like living in our climate. They like the opportunities that we provide. So I don't know if it's so much an issue of continuing to need to brand. But let me talk for a minute about groundwater. So Colorado River water imported into central Arizona has really been a story of groundwater. And the story of the future of the Colorado River in Arizona is a story of groundwater. The two are very, very connected. So when we imported Colorado River water into central Arizona, it mitigated and then avoided the depletion of our fossil groundwater supplies. Now, our fossil groundwater supplies in central Arizona are vast. Well, we are blessed to have very large and productive aquifers. And through the 1980 Groundwater Management Act, we did a pretty reasonable job, not perfect, but a pretty reasonable job of protecting those supplies for future generations. We have pretty strict regulations in central Arizona, not in other parts, that's a whole other issue, but we have pretty strict regulations that directly tie the subdivision of land and growth to the adequacy of supplies to avoid the depletion of fossil groundwater. So looking forward into a future where there is less Colorado River water with which we can replenish our groundwater supplies, the sustainable management of those groundwater supplies is going to become more important, but also more difficult. And I think it will be one of the most pressing public policy issues in Arizona. I think that we have to carefully consider land use in central Arizona, and we have to determine which uses of that land are worth the water, right? And I'm not going to weigh in on which ones I think are, which ones I think aren't. That's a public policy debate. But I think that we need to really focus on how we plan land use. Are we going to have semiconductors? Are we going to have subdivisions? Are we going to have dense cities? Are we going to have open spaces? And whatever that is, we need to plan for water use that is as efficient as possible, that is as smart as possible, so that we can continue to sustainably manage that groundwater. Central Arizona's ability to survive 100 years from now depends entirely on our ability to protect groundwater today. And so that is going to be the public policy issue of probably greatest importance in Arizona looking forward.
Thank you. John, and then Jennifer.
Okay. I guess I wanted to jump in just off the urban heat island effect and grass in cities, because, Vegas, we've now outlawed non-functional turf. It all has to be taken out by the end of 25. We've now prohibited the installation of any new turf except in schools, parks, and cemeteries. And we don't think it's going to have an effect on the urban heat island effect, an effect on the heat in the cities, as long as we preserve the trees. Right? And we've shown that the grass, even in mature areas, you can take out the grass and lay concentric drip irrigation around essentially the canopy of the tree, cover it, with rocks or, whatever, and the trees are fine. They'll live. To give you a sense of magnitude, 1 square foot of grass in the Mojave Desert, I'm not sure about in the Sonoran Desert, takes 73 gallons of water a year. 1 square foot of grass, 73 gallons a year. 1 square foot of trees or xeriscaping takes 17 gallons. So there is no real good reason to have turf anywhere in our cities in the Southwest, except for those functional areas where kids, grandkids are playing on them. So I just think as we grow, I agree with Kathryn on the smart planning, because, we're now looking at prohibiting evaporative cooling, which is hugely unpopular with our business community because it's far cheaper. You don't have to put the same amount of insulation in new buildings. It costs less to install evaporative coolers. The power footprint is far smaller with evaporative versus mechanical cooling. But one of the big pushbacks has been, our ESG metrics, right? Because those require you to drive down your power usage. Well, guess what? We can generate more power without putting more carbon in the atmosphere. We can't generate more water. So some of those ESG metrics really do need to be tweaked so they're not universal. We can't have the same metrics for New York and Las Vegas. We have to be able to localize those metrics to incentivize the kind of building and the kind of development that makes sense at the local level.
Just wanted to pick up quickly on something else Kathryn said about groundwater management and say that it's not limited to central Arizona. There's actually a big debate happening now at the Arizona legislature about rural groundwater management. And as the state sees its Colorado River supply diminished, I think it's more important than ever that those rural communities are enabled to protect their groundwater under their feet. And that is not moving at the moment at the Arizona legislature, and it puts existing communities, existing vulnerable communities at risk, not to mention all the springs and rivers that depend on groundwater for their flow.
Great, thanks. Well, I'm going to move to our last question, which is about processes and how we can make these actions happen, with what processes in place. And, there's sort of the informal process that exists in terms of 7 states coming together to talk about things. There's the Upper Colorado River Commission meetings, and there's, we've heard that the commissioner or secretary are going to be releasing pre-scoping for the next round of guidelines, maybe as early as next week. But welcome your thoughts about what processes are needed going forward. How do we solve some of the inequities that exist? We've heard that the processes work fine if you're, sort of a state or a major water user, but how do we ensure that tribes have a seat at the right tables? And how do we recognize that the environment is included at that table? And then we'll open it up for some additional discussion before we take a break at the end of the day. But who wants to tackle the process question first?
I'll start things off. I'm reminded by the question that there's been a lot of writing on the sort of lack of a formal structure, governance structure in the Colorado River Basin. And it's absolutely true. The basin has come up with its operating rules through an informal process. And that's worked. And I think that that is underway and has been being pursued and will continue to be. The concern is that that kind of process may intentionally or unintentionally exclude particular interests, and certainly in the past excluded the tribes. But there has been an absolutely good faith commitment on behalf of the basin states to remedying that exclusion and to including tribal sovereigns in these discussions. And the group that Daryl and Matt McKinney lead, the Water and Tribes Initiative for the Colorado River, is trying to facilitate the coalescing of tribal voices in a way that can feed into those discussions. It's not perfect, but I think there is certainly a higher level of commitment now than in the past to ensuring that tribal interests are taken into account, and an effort to include environmental interests, and sort of look at the river as a whole, the river as a river, and not only a plumbing system. I think we're seeing that now. As I said, I don't think it's perfect, but I don't know that a formal structure would be better. I'm not convinced of that. I think that the successes that we've seen in the past have been partly due to the fact that it was an informal structure and that negotiations could take place sort of behind closed doors, because that allows for more freedom of movement.
I would add to that there is a big difference between having a seat at the table and having influence. And so to give you an example of that, the city of Phoenix, which is the largest water utility in the state of Arizona, never had a formal seat at the table, ever. But we had a lot of influence. The Gila River Indian community does not have a formal seat at the table, but they have the largest allocation of Colorado River water in central Arizona. So they hold a lot of influence. So I think it's important to keep in mind, and I agree with Anne that there are formal processes, and certainly, you know, we need to be very careful about what that is and who is at that formal table. But there are many ways to exert influence in an informal manner that are just as effective.
So Kathryn, just a quick follow-up on that.
Sure.
Or were you happy not having a seat at the table?
Oh,
Well, there goes the
no.
rest of the time.
Oh, no. I think those of you who know me know that I'm always in for a good discussion. And so, no, but that's fine. You know, I understand the reasons for it. And so we were just always careful to exert our influence in other ways.
I don't see the reasons for it in today's world. Let me just make that statement. And the same would be true with the Gila River Indian community. I don't see what excluding people from that table gets us, especially in where we are right now.
Please.
So I actually don't, I think the environmental community is doing better at having relationships with the people who are in the room, but I actually think most of the time we are not well represented in this process. And I think it often comes from the fact that the people who are sitting at the table answer to constituencies who are principally made up of water users and simply don't have in the front of their minds to put first the concerns that the environmental community is bringing. I have been working in this field for more than 2 decades. I have the gray hair now to show it. And you know, in the early days, I really had to, it was a full-time job just trying to figure out what's going on. There's no bulletin board. And there was very little transparency, as you have heard. I think it's a little better. The Bureau is getting better with posting information. I actually got the 24-month study in my email yesterday. That might be the second time ever. Might be my fault for not having signed up in the right place, but I think it's the second time. So I would say back to kind of the bigger picture, you know, data is key. We talked about that. Transparency, I actually argue that we need transparency unless you're going to put some of the stakeholders who aren't represented at the table more directly there. And then facing reality, I would say relationships are key. That's why I stuck around for more than 2 decades. Money is key. And I'll go back to relationships and say they're key to that process, but they're also going to be key to the solutions. We're working in Mexico now, beginning to have conversations with irrigators. The NGOs are beginning to have conversations with the irrigators about technologies and practices that can help save water in the Mexicali Valley. And the federal government in Mexico is acknowledging that they don't have those relationships with the folks on the ground, the water users on the ground. The NGOs do. In order to get people to change practices, to change water use, we're going to need to build relationships and trust. So I think that's true at the grassroots level as well as at this policy negotiations level.
John?
Yeah, and I guess I would start off by saying, maybe this is pessimistic, I don't think there's a perfect solution out there. If every person who thought they should be at the table was at the table, I don't have an exact count, but it's somewhere between 300 and 3,000. I mean, it'd be a big table. And my experience, groups of people that big aren't really going to talk about the hard stuff that sometimes needs to be talked about. But that doesn't mean anybody's disenfranchised. So I'll talk about the tribes first. In Nevada, we have one tribe with Colorado River rights, and they were fully quantified in the decree in Arizona v. California. They have intakes in the river. They can take their water and have been, for a long time. I guarantee you, Arizona is not interested in me participating between ADWR, CAP, and the 22 tribes in Arizona in any way, shape, or form. So in some ways, it's like, what are you asking me for in terms of participation? But I do think over the last 18 months or so, there's been a real willingness of the 7 governors' reps to engage with the tribes through mostly Darrell's efforts. We've had conversations. We've agreed to when the next one of those will go. So there is, a process being established where, those 37 sovereigns can get together and talk about, what they need to talk about. But it's, given the structure where we are, we would not build it this way if we were starting from scratch. But the past is prologue, and the reservations are located within sovereign states, and there's going to be a different relationship between the sovereign state within which the reservation is located and the other 6 state sovereigns. That's just the way it's going to be for the foreseeable future. But I would really go back to Jennifer's point, about relationships, because I feel like, whatever tables I'm at, I'm going to have a pretty good sense of the deal breakers for the NGO community. And I'm going to be pretty vocal, telling my counterparts what those are, and that there's no real point in proceeding all along that pathway if we're not going to be able to survive. Because at the end of the day, I don't know exactly what the feds have in mind for August, but for whatever comes after 2026, it's almost certainly going to require congressional authorization. And if you show up to Congress with major national NGOs in opposition, or a huge number of tribes in opposition, or any one state in opposition, you're not going to get it through. And I'll give you the DCP as the example. I mean, Congressman Grijalva made it absolutely clear, if we don't have tribes showing up to support this, it's not moving through my committee. So yeah, you may not be at every table. That doesn't mean you don't have any power. So I do think we have to keep in mind that end game, where there's a whole lot of people that aren't sitting at every single table together that are necessary to advance substantial changes to the way this river operates.
Great, thank you. So I don't know, is Sean around or with a microphone? And let's see if there's questions in the audience.
While we're waiting for that question, can I add just real quickly? There's no silver bullet. There's only buckshot left, and we're just all going to get splattered. Like I don't see another way.
So I have just one quick observation while Sean's wandering around. I don't know what you took away from Jim's presentation this morning, but I sure saw the problem solution looked a whole lot more like 4 million than 2 million. And to my mind, that's a different kind of problem. 2 million's not too hard. 4 million's a really, really difficult. And I'd love to look more closely at what Jim produced. It went by really fast. There were some dense graphs, but the ones I looked at, I said 4 million.
Yeah. I don't see any hands. Here to the right side.
Like mushrooms also.
Sharon, and then,
Great panel and discussion. And I hope you don't mind that I'm going to pick up on Brad's point because it is related to this whole issue of negotiation. I've been sitting here wondering, like, what is the target number? 2 to 4 million is a pretty big range. And is the Reclamation Commissioner going to accept a proposal that's 2 million from the states and the other parties? So I'm wondering what you folks think about, should you go for the 4 million? And, if it ends up you come out with 3.25, you just go in and say, well, we came out with 3.25. You have any insights regarding that?
Here's what I would tell you about the lessons of the last 20 years and looking at that combined storage. If you remember back in 2007 or prior to 2007, the guidelines, the environmental community had a proposal called conservation before shortage. And the idea was, hey, let's be smart here. This is mass balance. We can jam on the brakes right at the edge of the cliff, apply them more slowly the closer we get. You're not going to win this game. I would argue more is better. And it gets to some of the points being made earlier here, which is we don't want to just go to equilibrium. We want to have a little more room to do things that we all want to do.
Yeah, well, I can guarantee you, as soon as they said between 2 and 4 million, the states heard 2. Which I guess I agree with Brad that Jim Prairie's presentation looked a whole lot more like 4, which makes sense because we're using 15, and if you think it's 11, right, that's what you probably need in permanent reductions to get to equilibrium. But they're also talking about by August to implement in 23, and there may well need to be some sort of, if we can get to 2, but we know that isn't enough. They were also showing it over a 4 or 5 year period, so there may need to be some form of ramp up, I would guess.
yeah, and I would say the second you painted it too, we're going to be back in crisis management. And so, like I was talking with Bill Hazenkamp earlier in terms of, with the PVID Met deal, like you need to be able to turn it up and back based on the hydrology that we see. And anyhow, it's a good point, Sharon, to be sure. Up there.
So thanks. Let me add my thanks to the panel. It's really a terrific discussion, and it's been very helpful to think about these issues and to hear your perspectives on it. I wanted to ask a question about, I guess, to put it simply, alfalfa. You've talked a little bit about rural communities, the importance of keeping them healthy, and ag, and the role that ag's going to have to play to some extent. But to some extent, this seems a little bit like the elephant in the room. We grow a lot of alfalfa in the basin. It uses a lot of water. We end up exporting millions of tons of our alfalfa, effectively, I think, exporting our water to places like China and the Middle East. And I'm just wondering how we can address this problem. It does seem to me that we need to move away from alfalfa. I think ideally we provide some of this funding to farmers to help them switch. I know switching isn't just a matter of turning on another switch. It's a little more complicated than that, but it does seem to me that if we can incentivize farmers moving away from alfalfa and moving to other less water intensive crops, that it would be a way to continue to let farmers farm and keep our rural communities healthy while trying to save quite a lot of water, it seems to me. And I know, Brad, you've written about this. I'm sure others have ideas about this. I'm just curious if you all have any ideas about how we might address this problem, or maybe you don't think it's a problem, but I guess.
I might want to say something.
Yeah, John is spring-loaded on this question.
Look, I'm at war with Bermuda grass, okay? I wasn't particularly looking for a fight with another species of grass. But again, I go back to the math is the math. And it's not just alfalfa. I'm actually looking for a fight with multiple species of hay, as it turns out, because I've learned a lot. It's alfalfa, it's Sudan grass, it's pasture grass in the upper basin. It's 80% of 80%. You don't balance the books, you don't reach equilibrium growing that amount of hay. And I would throw the cities in there and say we should be doing the same thing with Bermuda and fescue, but it's just mass balance. So the good news is you can grow all the winter fruits and vegetables you want, right? You can grow all the orchard crops that you want, but you're not going to be able to grow all the forage crops you want and have the basin, reach equilibrium and have all the other things that people talked about today.
Brad, do you want to say something?
Oh, I'll just get myself into trouble.
Welcome to the boat.
I'll pass.
I'll jump in a little bit. I think that states are not incentivized to pick crops. But the market system will ultimately sort out low value production. And, you heard a bit of that in we can continue to grow winter vegetables because they're high value. And I think as we evolve into this 11 million acre territory or whatever, there's going to be a lot more sorting out. But I can't see a directive about alfalfa or any other species. I just think that's not territory that the state water managers want to get into.
There's been a fair bit of work on crop switching. Let me just jump into this really quickly. So if you ask a producer to crop switch, to the extent I know about this, which is about this big, you're asking for new knowledge, you're asking for new labor, new equipment, new markets, new processing, new transportation. So let's not underestimate what it is we're asking for, and this kind of gets to being able to spend money to help these transitions happen.
But we have seen transitions in the past, semolina, pennycress. There's other crops where you've seen farmers and ranchers shift because the demand signals are there. And so we are definitely working on some crop switching ideas, both in terms of research, working with corporations like Bridgestone, which is exploring guayuli, which uses a lot less water than alfalfa, and they're exploring, production in Arizona, barley. And I think, when you talk about winter lettuce, every time you talk about, we got to look at agriculture, well, this is where we get the winter lettuce. Maybe that's appropriate to be growing the winter lettuce, but in the summertime, should you be growing alfalfa and shipping it to China or Saudi Arabia? That's, an interesting question. And I'll leave it there. So I think we're up here, up there, and then we'll come down there and back up there.
Hi, it's a comment, not really a question, but today generally has been really good. I've been really impressed by everyone speaking today, so thanks for that. Just something that a couple of you noted here at the end was just about the idea of participation for tribes. And one thing I heard a couple times was, well, participation may not be as important as influence. I think that's okay if you're Gila. I think it's okay if you're Crit, right? But for the other tribes who aren't that, participation has meant everything for tribes in the last 70 plus years, right? Ever since we've gotten out of this termination era, right? What the tribes are asking for is for participation. They may not be able to have a lot of influence, but participation means a lot. That's why consultation has been such a four-letter word forever, but we still need to have it because it can grow out of that into something very meaningful, right? So I guess I just want to be careful when we think about tribes and having just influence, but participation being so important that we can't overstress it. Daryl can't overstress it. So I want to make sure that's a point.
It's a really fair point. So thank you for bringing that up. And I would say it is a frustration that is shared by the small cities as well, right? So it's one thing for Phoenix to have influence, and that's great. Tucson, the big dogs in Arizona. But, if you're Queen Creek, if you're, these other small towns, yeah, that is a similar frustration. But it's really difficult to figure out where that balance is and how many people have that formal seat and how else we can expand the tent, as Ann said, I think last year, in an inclusive way. But thank you for bringing that up. It's a very reasonable point. Absolutely.
I think we have time for maybe one or possibly two more questions. We've got here and then in the back, and then we'll send you off to the happy hour.
So I hear two different sort of narratives of framing. One is the issue is what to do when there's a really low flow. And do we find that as, 11 or 13 or whatever? But when you hit that, how do we divide water among people? And when you don't hit that, then we keep going as we are. But John talked about equality of risk. And equality of risk, to me, and this is being academic, means you have percentage shares. And then everybody has, everybody faces the same risk, which is the baseline, the stream flow or whatever. And so equality of risk is different from what you're talking about, or the main narrative is just sharing what happens, when we hit bottom. Why isn't there any thinking in terms of just having percentage shares, states or whatever, and you all live with the risk? And I think there's two reasons. One is the other framing creates the notion that there could be a surplus sometimes. And then if we have a surplus, we can do things with the surplus. So we have kind of allotments, but then there's this. And the other opposition is people with senior rights, like California, don't want to be subordinated. There is a fundamental conflict between a priority system and an equal sharing. And I think the larger issue is in the face of climate change and these extreme uncertainties we face, whether one really needs equal sharing and not a priority. Or maybe you could have a somewhat differentiated sharing. But I think there's an unwillingness to take seriously what John says about equality of risk.
I would love for Central Arizona to have the same risk as everyone else. I think that would be great. Yeah, but there's a few obstacles. But all options need to be on the table, and we need to be really innovative.
Right, but I think you kind of answered your own question, right? But prior appropriation in its DNA is a system founded upon inequality of risk. So, it's sort of like the, sin of the first bite of the apple. Everything came from that.
Yep.
So do we want to take one last question, then we'll, yeah, please.
Thank you. I really appreciate the discussion on process. And I heard there a little bit from John at the end about participation. And even if you don't have a seat at the table, you're being represented in some way. I was curious about transparency because it's been brought up a lot. And I have trouble, I understand both sides. I understand when Ann said sometimes you want an opaque process that helps move along. John also said sometimes it's an opaque process that's needed. Jennifer said that transparency is needed. John, you had said equity includes transparency. So just kind of curious, thinking in the context of the post-2026 negotiations, what should transparency be like over the next couple of years?
Well, I guess I do think that for the post-2026, guidelines, rules, whatever, we haven't even decided what to call them yet. I think you're gonna have a level of transparency on those that you haven't had since at least the negotiation of the 07 guidelines because of NEPA. Everybody's, comments and scoping are gonna be public. Everybody's, what they think should be the preferred alternative or is gonna be public. So it's going to be a substantially more transparent and different process than some of the things like, for example, the DCP, which was kind of negotiated in smaller groups and in an emergency management kind of context to bring that about. So this process we're kicking off between now and August and for the next 4 years, I don't yet know exactly what that looks like, but at least for post 2026, I think there's going to be a pretty bright spotlight on what people's positions are.
Kathryn, do you want to say a word?
No.
No? Okay.
Really
All right.
tired.
Great. Well, we're going to hand it back over.
So first of all, I want to thank the panel. I have a special appreciation to the full day's panelists because something remarkable has been happening here and in the community around the Colorado River Basin. And I've been thinking about a lot about this in recent months because this is a community of people that has been, for me, in the dozen years that I've been trying to document what they do, a delight. And the reason that this is a community that's been a delight is because they have been working so hard and largely so successfully in accomplishing things that they all were passionate about, which is trying to figure out a way as our water supply shrank to keep the West that we all love, to find ways to right the wrongs to the tribal communities, to find ways to right the wrongs to the environment, to figure out how to slowly shrink our water footprint to keep the cultural and community integrity of our rural agricultural communities, to keep these big cities that we all so love. And it was a community that felt successful at doing that. And there was a lot of passion and pride in this community. And I think what we're in the middle of now is a moment of grieving, to realize that those tools that we thought we had and were developing are not going to be enough, and that this West is going to be very different. There's less water. What are we going to do with this sort of fundamental question? And so I think we need to kind of recognize this moment of reckoning that we are at, but still recognize that the community and the skills and the tools that we have become that much more important as these challenges get more difficult. And I want to conclude by reiterating a point Ann made. This only works, the only way we can do this is if we can go back to our communities and say, here's what we need to sacrifice, everybody else is sacrificing too. So thank you. Sean, do you want to fill us in on what happens next and give us a rundown on tomorrow?
Well, first, I'd just like to thank everyone that joined us online. We will see you all tomorrow. I want to thank, on behalf of the Getches-Wilkinson Center in Colorado, all our speakers and panelists today. I want to thank you all for being here, and I hope you all will join me in thanking John Fleck. That's it for today. We'll see you all tomorrow. We did way too good a job staying on track today, so you might need to give us a few minutes to finish setting up the reception. So thank you.
Great job.
Thank you.
I love the baseball card. That was very good.